Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guest for today. Welcome mentors to our podcast today, Mentorships in Education, which is sponsored by Just Education First at justeducationfirst.com. This is your host, Judith Epstein. We are going to continue with our mini-series on dyslexia, and today we have a very special guest that I would like to introduce to you, Russell Van Brocklen. He is going to tell us a little bit about some of what he does, but first I would like to give you some information about his background and some of the amazing work that he's doing in working with children who have dyslexia and how he addresses some of their organizational skills and their reading struggles. Russell Van Brocklen combined brain research in overcoming dyslexia with the 3 default writing strategies in Strategies for Struggling Writers while he was in graduate school. As a result, his initial research program was funded by the New York State Senate and is owned by SUNY Research Foundation. He found that motivated high school students, in other words, kids that really want to learn, who have dyslexia, increase their writing skills. Now listen to this, 7 to 8 grade levels in one academic year. Russell has presented at the Everyone Reading Conference in Manhattan in 2006, and in a series of years, 2014 to 2019. He also presented in November of 2018 at the conference run by the Learning Disability Association of New Jersey. I will also mention that Russell has a law background, although he's not a lawyer, and he has a program out there, this program that he has, which is called the Writing Project. So Russell, thank you so much. It's so nice to have you, and I also want to thank you for driving such a long distance. Russell and I had a special meeting where he was willing to come into Massachusetts and meet with me, so we were able to sit and talk over lunch. I don't get to do that very often, and it was a very special treat. So I want to thank you very much for doing that, Russell. Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me for lunch, but honestly, for things that are important, like your podcast, people should make the effort to come out and see you. And even if it's a half-a-day drive each way, it's well worth it. Because unlike other podcasts that I've been on, I found yours is really well organized. And as a former teacher, you really understand things from both the students, parents, and teachers' perspective. And that effort you put in is really important. So it's well worth the drive out to meet you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to make a note that that was not a paid political announcement. Okay. Russell, can you tell us a little bit about your experience going through school as a young dyslexic student? I don't know, when you found out about your struggle, but what was your experience like going through the system?
Well, I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in 2nd grade, and I was literally forced into special education during third grade for most of my classes. And to be honest with you, this really upset me because it took me away from my friends and it took away from my ability to actually learn, which is something I was always interested in, even when I was extremely young. And there was one project that it still haunts me to this day. I recall I was in fifth grade, and my friends were taking this really hard and really interesting project on the Pilgrims, and I couldn't participate because I was in special education where really they taught me almost nothing. They didn't really know what to do with me, and it was just incredibly frustrating, and especially when you're a young child and you want to be with your friends, and that's really important for your social development. But I was carted away to be in what was called that time as the retard program. And actually, I was called names like that because I was in special education all throughout my schooling years, but especially when I was younger. Then finally, what happened when I was in eighth grade, I wanted out when I started eighth grade. I wanted to start getting out of this program. So with the help of a neighbor who was on the school board, I forced my way out for history only as an additional class when I was in eighth grade. And that's when things really started to change for me. My teacher's name was Mr. Fitzgerald. He was also the modified school's football coach, so he was a very serious teacher, and you paid attention to his class. But he actually required us to think on his quizzes and exams. He didn't have us just regurgitate, or what I call playing parrot, which is where you memorize a bunch of dates and facts and just regurgitate them on a test.
Right.
We actually had to think, or we wouldn't do well on his test. And with very little effort, and I mean almost no effort, I got all, except for one test, I got perfect 100s on all his quizzes and tests, because I was actually required to think. So that was a revelation for me. So at the end of eighth grade, I actually won the history prize. And then I went back to my neighbor who's on the school board, and I said, I want out for everything. Look what I did in eighth grade. And with her assistance, I was mainstreamed in a traditional college preparatory curriculum right for my first day of high school. I ended up with an 86 average for my first quarter, a 95 at the end for my last quarter, where I was fourth in my class out of about 150 students. And with that, what shocked me is my special ed teacher, I generally took my exams in the special education room because it was quieter than all the other students. She said, I really didn't earn that. I couldn't be anything more than a janitor, and then I should come back into the special education program. Well, this really infuriated me. And from that point on, I really just didn't care about grades. I was there to learn. So when I entered college, I literally did something unusual. I took professors, not institutions. And I went from college to college to college, taking the very best professors in the areas that I was interested in, and then I moved on. But I spent most of my time at SUNY Center of Buffalo. But probably one of the most defining moments of my life is when I enrolled in 1997 in the New York State Assembly internship program. Now, what was interesting is
Russell, I'm going to stop you for 1 minute. Okay. What was important about SUNY that you found it served your needs? What are some of the determining factors that you looked at there that maybe our listeners would be interested in if they're looking for colleges for their students? Why did you like them there?
One professor and one professor only. His name is Dr. James Holmes. And if it were not for him, I would be nothing today. I would have been nothing at all. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Holmes. He's dyslexic himself, and he teaches a class called Intermediate Macroeconomics. And in that class, he showed us how to clearly think. And what do I mean by that? He taught us a method called causality, where we would look at two variables and see what the results would be, and then compare those results with the results of comparing other variables, and then combine them slowly, painfully, and thoroughly in order to glean a significant insight.
But you didn't know he was there at the beginning when you first
Yes,
went
I did.
there.
I specifically went to SUNY Center of Buffalo because of him. People who took his intermediate macroeconomics class,
interesting.
which is still considered the best course in that entire department, they told me to go and see him because of that class. So I went and I took that class. And what I simply did, instead of looking at things slowly, carefully, and painfully, like he showed us, I found a way to hyper-accelerate that process by adding multiple dimensions and the ability, therefore, to think very clearly and to process a lot of complex materials. And it was like my brain was turned on.
So from there, you began to expand your experiences at different colleges?
I took some different colleges before that and after that, but primarily it was what Dr. Holmes showed me. So just so you know a little bit about his background, he mentioned, this isn't exactly perfect from my memory, but he did mention people in the school newspaper that he was dyslexic, so I'm not giving away anything. But he mentioned that now remember, he's in his early 80s now and he's still teaching, so we're going back a while. He said when he was in high school, he wanted to go to college, but they wouldn't let him in. So he got second or third grade in a national science competition. So they let him into a good college, but then they told him any degree associated with reading, he wasn't allowed to get, from what I recall. He focused more on the advanced sciences and mathematics and economics. So what he told me is the first his time in college, he wasn't as good as his eventual peers, a little better the last 2 years. But when he went to the University of Chicago for graduate school, top of his class, day one. And that's what I found interesting. And so when I looked at this, I started asking other professors, dyslexic professors that didn't go to a private dyslexic school but went through a general education public school, what happened. They all told me the same thing. Against their eventual peers, they weren't very good in the first 2 years of college, a little better their last two, but once they entered their graduate program, top of their class, day one. And that got me thinking, what's going on here? What's the secret? So in that regard.
Does that have to do with your enrolling at the New York State Assembly?
That, I didn't really understand that until after I was finished with my assembly internship program. But what you can say is my assembly internship pushed me to ask these most critical questions to finally solve dyslexia. So when I was in the New York State Assembly internship is probably one of the most pivotal points in my life.
Okay.
So basically when I entered, they're like, they had two types of programs, an undergraduate program where you're essentially like an office clerk, answering phones, filing papers, maybe occasionally doing something of significance. The reason being is you need to show that you're serious about doing the mundane stuff before they can trust you with something real. If they can't trust you to photocopy, how can they trust you to deal with constituents' problems? So graduate students, on the other hand, are real staff members. They do very complex things. They are integrally involved in their particular departments, just like a very seasoned staff member. So they didn't want me messing up the filing because I'm dyslexic, so they placed me in the Majority Leaders Program and Counsel's office where they had several administrative assistants, and they hadn't had an undergraduate there in decades. So they treated me like a graduate student. Right. I had the best internship. The problem is the program was run by a professor out of, I believe it was University of Syracuse, and he was a senior professor with like 15, 20 years of experience, and we had to write for the academic portion a paper. And I asked if I could do an oral presentation instead, and he said yes. So at the end of the program, they recommended 15 credits of A-, or about a 3.67.
Wow, that's great.
Well, actually, I have 15 credits of F in my transcript.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, because I did an oral report instead of writing out a paper. So,
well, is that because you don't get the same credit for an oral report?
It got me an F, 15 credits of 0.
Wow.
Yeah, so that destroyed my GPA. So I can't tell you how frustrated I am with this. It's been this has been 22 years since that program has since then. And I'm still the only person in the history of that program. And they run through 150 kids or whatever it is a year. And I'm the only one that still has had that happen to him. So my goal at that point was, I said, I want to solve this writing problem so nobody else has to go through this. So after spending a couple of years trying to figure out some way of doing this, I re-enrolled in SUNY Center at Buffalo in the fall of 2001.
Okay.
So what my goal was, I want you to imagine this. If you go to graduate school, remember what I said when I talked to Dr. Holmes and other senior dyslexic professors? And by that, I meant full professors. I didn't talk to assistant or associates. I wanted the most accomplished academics I could find.
Right.
And they said once they hit graduate school, they own the place. So that brought me to a book called Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz.
I'm very familiar with that book. I've read it from cover to cover.
It is simply the most important book on the science of dyslexia, I would have to say, in the last 30 years. So what I'm going to point to you now is there's a brain image.
All right, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute, but you said it's the most important book that's written on dyslexia. And I'm sure there are some, I know you want to talk about the brain, but I'd like you to pinpoint the most important aspects of the book. If one of them is the brain, then tell us the other areas that are important. Be specific so that people who are listening will have an understanding of why they should be going to this book. They might not be interested in the brain, but they might be interested in something else. So kind of keep that in mind, like if you were doing an outline, what would be your main headings here under Sally Shaywitz?
The main point is to actually have verified scientific fact on how the dyslexic brain is different from what Dr. Shaywitz calls the non-impaired brain or the brain of a typical general education student. So we can actually look at it and see the strengths and weaknesses, the hard science. So what I would like our listeners to do is just to go to Google and type in Yale dyslexia and brain image. So it's Yale dyslexia and brain image. And what you're going to see are two brains, and you're going to see non-impaired brain, and then below that you're going to see the dyslexic brain. Okay, now you can, if it doesn't show up right away, just go to images and go through, you'll see it. And what you're going to notice, and this is really important because now we're talking about hard science. Okay, this was probably millions of dollars of federally funded and private research grants to come up with this. I can't stress how important this hard science is. So when you look at this, let's first of all look at the non-impaired brain. You look at the back part of the brain, and now what I'm about to do is to really oversimplify some massively complex neuroscience to make it understandable for your listeners. So for the teachers and scientists out there, if I get a little bit too simplified, please forgive me for that. But I'm just I'm doing this to make a general point, an aha moment that I'm looking for people to get. Okay. So if you look at the back part of the brain, you're going to see this massive neuroactivity in areas associated with word analysis and word form. Now, if you look at the dyslexic brain, it's going to show no neural activity, but if you look at it from a different angle, there is some. So what a huge part of the research in dyslexia is to try to make the back part of the dyslexic brain look more like that of the non-impaired brain. And there was one company that did very interesting work in this area called Scientific Reading Corporation, and they were able to increase reading levels by 1 to potentially 3 grade levels within 3 to 12 months or a little bit longer by essentially, again, oversimplifying this, a really advanced kind of video game. They literally increased the back part of the dyslexic brain's neuroactivity quite a bit. Let's look at, again, the results of that. You're looking at most a 2 or 3 grade level increase in reading within 3 to 12 months or maybe a little bit longer, very inexpensively compared to other programs. Now, if you're in elementary or middle school, that's significant. But what if you're in high school? What if you're in college and you're reading at the 4th grade level, and now you're reading at the 7th grade level. So how do we be more efficient about this? Well, this is what confuses me completely about why other researchers aren't looking at this most important part of the brain. I now want to draw your attention to the front part of the brain. And you see the massive neural activity increase. I've had people tell me that it looks like the dyslexic brain is 2 to 3 times more active. I honestly think it's 3 times. Other people will say twice. Any which way, we're talking about a massive overactivity in this part of the brain. And if you look at the bottom part, which says this deals with articulation and word analysis. Now, this is where I want to draw you to this aha moment. Let's look at the difference between the front part and the back part. The back part deals with word form. Basically, I'm going to equate that with elementary school. Both deal with word analysis, but the front part deals with articulation, which to me means a much more evolved, much more advanced part of our educational system. And again, really oversimplifying this, this is really focusing on what I like to call graduate school, where dyslexics really own the place once we walk in. And the question comes back, why is that? Well, that has to deal with the fact that we are in our specialty. What you're going to find with people that have learning differences, ADHD, dyslexia, is that we excel in a very narrow area. So let me give you an example. If any of you have ever seen the movie Fast and Furious, the original one, and you have the mechanic, the designer of cars, sitting, designing a car for the star, and the star is asking, why are you in MIT? How can you're so smart? He said, well, I'm only good in this narrow area. That's all I can really do. So when we're in graduate school, we are asked to make a major contribution in this very small, narrow area that we excel in. And that's the benefit of having dyslexia. So let me give you an example when it came to me, when my turn came. And this is a very hard thing to talk to people who have been through graduate school when you say, your time has come. It's your turn to contribute. And if you can't, you're pretty much done. If you can go on to become a university professor or have very interesting positions in the public and private sectors. What do I mean by your contribution? Well, in graduate school, professors don't really care about grades. They really don't care about your board scores like your GREs or your GMAT. They expect you're an excellent student or you wouldn't be there. What they care about is your ability to contribute knowledge. Why is that so important? Well, if you look at how professors are promoted, it's not in their teaching abilities generally, it's their ability to make groundbreaking research projects, to really add knowledge to the field, which requires a lot of funding. Those that can get promoted, those that can't don't. So when my turn came, what I decided to do was I looked at the K through 12 issue and I said, you know what, let's go after the hardest part, which what I found would be high school juniors and seniors. And in my research project, what we found is that these kids had 7th, 8th grade writing skills. So I want you to ask you this really serious question. For those of you that are college graduates, wherever you went to college, if you went to your college with an 8th grade writing skill, what's going to happen? Let's not sugarcoat this. Let's look at this in reality. What's going to happen? You're going to flunk out. So these kids were going to college, regardless. So we had increased their writing skills from the 7th, 8th grade level so they could function in college.
So, Russell, I'm going to stop you for just a minute because you kind of touched on your grant for the Research Foundation of the State of University and in New York. And I'd like you to just, with this background knowledge that we have now and some of the reflective questions you've asked our mentors, I'd like to understand a little bit about what your direction was with your research. You received some grant money also from other resources. What was it that you were researching in these areas?
The purpose of the project was I wanted to bring, for these highly motivated students, I wanted to bring their writing skills up to the graduate level. So as simply stated, I want them to have the writing skills that they're supposed to have at the completion of college or near the completion of college before they started. So with that, I examined the most widely used SAT type test for going into graduate school, and that was the Graduate Records Exam Analytical Writing Assessment. So to start off, I was told by the New York State Education Department, this program was eventually funded under the sponsorship of New York State Assembly Majority Leader Bruno's office. His office sent me over to the New York State Education Department, and they said, listen, you want to change things? We want a SUNY Distinguished Professor to evaluate this, which is their absolutely highest ranked. And out of all the professors at SUNY College at Buffalo and SUNY Center at Buffalo, there were only 2 distinguished professors in psychology. The one that had the better reputation was Dr. Holichka, and she also just happened to give me evaluation 5 years before for college. So I went and asked her if she would be willing to do the initial evaluation. She said yes. The New York State Education Department paid for it, and I went through a 2-day exam. And at the end, she said, "Listen, my native writing skills, when my brain is off, is in early elementary school, and when I turn my brain on, it's above average entering graduate school. It's a light switch." So she said this worked. The next step that I had to do is I had to link it up to another professor's research, which was Dr. James Collins he's a full professor at SUNY Center at Buffalo, and he wrote a book called Strategies for Struggling Writers, primarily gen ed struggling writers with mild dyslexia, and I extended his work to severe dyslexia. So that took me, as I said, my time came. It took me a little under 2 weeks for me to submit my paper, and he put an A on it. So the next step, 6 months later, I entered, during that 6 months, a university-wide business plan competition, and I won second place for $15,000. Now, at that point, everything changed for me. I recall one time I was sitting with one of my senior professors, and we're spending a half an hour talking about sports, just meaningless, get to know each other discussion, and he has a line of graduate students out his door. And I'm getting concerned about this because they want to come in for a couple of minutes for their weekly discussion and then to leave to work on the research. And he said, your project's funded. Theirs isn't. They can wait. And that's kind of told me when I really arrived. So seriously. So the other kids were asking me, like, are you in the doctorate program here? And I was like, no, I'm dyslexic, but you're spending all your time with him. We don't have access to that. I said, yeah, my research is funded. Apparently yours isn't, and that makes all the difference. So that's where I really learned the importance of funding, because the professor I was speaking with brought in about $500,000 to $1 million a year and had a half a dozen undergraduate students that came from around the world to work with him.
Now, you said that in your research, I just want to, is this some of the research that you tried to connect or align with the author of Strategies of Struggling Writing?
Right. Yes. So basically, to simplify making the connection and what we were able to do with it. So at this point, I just connected the overactive front part of the brain, articulation, word analysis from Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz with the 3 default writing strategies of Dr. Collins: copying, visualization, and narrative. And what we initially came up with was we literally showed the students, we worked with them on the GRE. So we gave them, what it ended up happening was it was 2 students outside of school, 11 students inside a program over 2 years funded by the New York State Senate, and then several students that we worked with after the program. One is level as a gentleman in his 30s with an MBA from Columbia. So essentially what we did is we ran them through the program paragraph by paragraph, where we really focused on organizing their thinking, and the results were really impressive. The students that scored in the 0 percentile jumped to about the 30th percentile in the GRE, and the ones that scored in the 6th percentile jumped to approximately the 70th percentile.
Now, this was just using your integrated method.
Right.
that you're calling the writing project.
Writing methods.
Writing method. Okay, yes. The writing method. You're bringing in the studies of Sally Shaywitz and this Mr. Collins, and you're taking components of them and you've put them together to create a new program.
Yes. So my addition to, again, just let's discuss what the end result was. The teacher learned the process, not like Wharton Gillingham, which is 3 years to become certified. In the public school, she learned the process in 3 hours.
Wow.
Then she came back and said, I don't like this for a number of reasons. And we said, go ahead and change it in major ways. And she did. When she taught this for 2 years in a public school funded by the New York State Senate, she was teaching in ways I never thought were possible, but she got the same results. But what were the real results? The real results were that all the kids, the 11 kids that went through this and the ones we taught privately, all graduated from college. Now, the students that scored at approximately the 30th percentile, they went to schools such as the State University of New York at Albany, ranked around 100, 120 out of 3,000 in the country, with grades between about a 2.5 to about a 2.75. The students that scored in the 70th percentile graduated with grades between a 3 and a 3.6. The key thing is none of these kids ever used any accommodations. None. It was offered. They refused. In addition, the spelling and grammar, the teacher said that she spent almost no time on the spelling and grammar. It auto-corrected. So the simple question is, how do we get things to autocorrect? So this is where I'm going to add my contribution, which are what I call the 2 questions, which I found kind of interesting because out of all the research I've done, this is what, when I present at all the conferences, this is what other researchers are telling me is my major contribution.
Now, these are 2 questions. I was going to ask you about those, so I'm glad you brought them up. These are 2 questions that you ask every student that you work with. Is that correct?
Yes, because here's the key thing. This is the key thing for parents and teachers. They tried everything. I have had some parents come to me, they spent over $100,000 and they're not getting the results. And I tell them that essentially I have this miracle program that they think essentially I wave my magic wand and their kid's doing great. Well, it's not magic. If you understand the science, it's actually very easily explained. So let me go over the first of these 2 questions. So what's going to happen is if I'm dealing with a kid that has severe dyslexia, to ADHD, to ADD, they're going to answer yes to one or both of these questions. And based on that answer, I can then begin the conversation to get their buy-in to solve the problem. So the problem most of them look at is they'll try these different programs that have been funded for millions of dollars, and they're just not getting the results, or it's so inefficient because they're still expected to learn at a certain rate and they got to learn all their previous material, and it just overwhelms them. So let's go over the 2 questions. This one is really important. And this is me asking a student, have you ever found that when you have a topic that you really care about and something that you really want to write about, as soon as you take your fingers and you put them on the keyboard, and when I do this, I literally show my fingers, keyboard, and I ask this most critically important question. Do you have idea, when you put your fingers on the keyboard, do you find that the idea just flies out of your head, leaving you with an empty head? So let me go over this.
All right, so let me go slow that. You said that very quickly. Do you find that the ideas just fly out of your head, out of your mind, and leave you with an empty thoughts?
Yeah, just to be more
okay.
specific. So you have ideas in their head. They're flying around at light speed with little to no organization. They want to write about it. So they have the idea. They want to communicate it. They want to write about it. So they take their fingers, they put it on the keyboard, and then does the idea just fly out of their head, leaving them with an empty brain? And for students with severe dyslexia, they're almost always going to answer yes to that question. The kids with ADD, ADHD generally answer no. So then that moves us on to our next question, where virtually all the kids are going to answer yes. And that's when I say, have you found that when you have ideas in your speciality, flying around your head at light speed, key question, do you have little or no organization? So let's kind of go over that again. What do I mean by their speciality? Virtually all students with it that are learning difference, ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, they have a very narrow area that they like to play in. That's their extreme interest. And in that area, do you have ideas flying around your head at light speed, key question, but with little to no organization? Once they answer yes to one or both of these questions, then I tell them the primary problem that you have is lack of organization in your brain. So let's fix that using writing as the measurable output to force your brain to organize. And while we do that, a lot of your concerns in reading and writing and math will self-correct to some extent. So my purpose is not to sit there trying to show you every little rule there is, but to put your brain in a position to have it autocorrect a lot of these concerns by focusing on an area that the student is really interested in. So I'd like to give you an example of that. Casey's mother contacted me when she was in 5th grade, and I have full permission from both Casey and her mother to tell her story. Casey was 10 years old in 5th grade with a 2nd grade reading level. So I asked Casey these questions. She said yes to both, and she said she was really interested in Theodore Roosevelt. So what I try to do with my students is have them pick a very famous person, to pick a biography that's well written for them to learn from. So I assigned her The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt is 920 pages approximately, won the Pulitzer, and is generally considered 10th grade material. And here we have poor Casey, who's in 5th grade with a 2nd grade reading level. I gave her a very simple process, and within 6 months, she was reading her book fluently. Now, what was interesting about this is Casey mentioned that when she was in silent reading in 6th grade, some of her classmates came up, and some of them were some of the smartest kids in her class, and asked, "What's that with this big, thick book?" And she said this is a book she's working on for a project after school. And they would pick it up and try to get through it, and she said none of her classmates could get past the first paragraph. So she went from among, if not the worst reader in her grade, to the best. Now, reading, as I'd like to describe, reading is the input, then we have processing, and writing is the measurable output.
Okay, that's actually something I was going to ask you about, because you were talking to me about that earlier, and you said that's one of the ways that you evaluate students, having reading as the input and writing as the measurable output. So can you take each one of those and show us how they combine to create an assessment process, I guess, that you use when you're working with students?
Well, it's more than an assessment.
Okay.
It's the solution. So first of all, what I want you to think about when we graduate from our education and we enter the real world of work, everybody wants it in writing. It disgusts me to no end, but this is how the world works. I have to be able to communicate in writing, or as Dr. Holmes told me, I was going to be dog food. So writing is simply a measurable output. I can give you a writing sample, and you can tell me very quickly approximately what grade level it is. Reading, we're expected to be able to do it, and it's very hard to judge somebody's reading level. So the first thing that we do when we start working with a new student is I ask them to pick out a historical figure that they're very interested in. And with Casey, it was Theodore Roosevelt. The next step is we have to find an audio book on Audible and a real book on Amazon. Simply, these are just the biggest vendors that have the most selection. And when they pick out their book, critically important, they have to like the narrator. If they don't like the narrator, we move to a different book or to a different historical person. And the book has to have won the Pulitzer, National Book Award, or some other writing award. So basically, what we did with Casey, she picked out The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. And as far as the reading, it's really simple. I would tell Casey to listen to the book, while trying to read it, while trying to answer a very specific question.
So you were advocating for the audio version. Students listen to an audio version of what they're trying to read while they're learning to read it. Is that
right? But you also have to add the third component of trying to answer a very specific question. So
okay?
normally,
So they have a focus to the reading.
right. But
okay.
Why are we doing this? Because remember when I asked those first two questions? It's
right.
lack of organization. My students simply describe it as being scatterbrained. How do we reduce scatterbrain by 80, 90%? By having them listen to the book while trying to read it, or trying to answer a very specific question. I generally start off with our person they're interested in is the hero. What does the hero want to do? So they're specifically trying to do that, and then scatterbrain reduces 80, 90%. So then I typically, with my first program, is I'll have them go through paragraph by paragraph, and I'll have the student put a mark under each word that they don't know. And you can imagine it's virtually every word. Then I have them look up each word in either Oxford English or Merriam-Webster. Dictionary.com is banned because it's too simplistic. They find their word, they find their definition, they type out the word, they type out the definition. And do you
use the thesaurus at all?
Well, that's what I call thesaurusizing. Let me first of all describe this.
All right.
So they do that for every word. And yes, that's a lot of work. And I had parents come and say, my child will never do this. But recall, we're in their speciality. This is what they're really interested in. And I had kids like Casey. She would do this for hours a night on her own. It got so bad that she was not doing her homework. I had to say, you had to do your homework, not just what I'm doing. She said, well, that makes no sense, and your stuff makes sense. But, she literally spent hours a night for that 6 months. So, and then as they go to the next paragraph, the same words are going to be showing up a lot. And by the time you get through a 920-page book, you're reading. So that's pretty much a basic outline of the reading program. Now, as far as what I call thesaurization, remember that when you look at the graph of the brain, you see where it says word analysis in the front? To me, word analysis is the thesaurus. So in my experience is once students are appropriately trained, students with learning differences are actually better using a thesaurus than the vast majority of their gen ed classmates, general education classmates. So what do I mean by thesaurization? In order to organize an essay, I'll ask a student, who's the hero? What does the hero want to do? And once they type that, I ask for a first grade level sentence to start off with. Then I'll look for two words, what I call an action word, a word that's going to take the hero from where they are towards their goal, and the most important word. If they're the same, we move on to the next step. If they're different, the student picks which way they want to go, and I generally ask for the more complicated version. Once we have what I call their starting universal theme, we'll then take that word and put it in a thesaurus. And literally, this is how we get them ready for the future SAT, for advanced words and understanding them, and also for advanced words when they're going to be taking their graduate school entrance test. So what they do is they'll then take their word, put it into thesaurus.com, and I'll have them look up each word, type out the word and the definition. This is what I call thesaurusizing. They'll find a better word. This is kind of complicated, but let me explain it. As they're going through this, the first word they selected is generally not a very educated word and very broad. We're looking for something much more precise and much in the student's view, and then also much more educated. And they find a better word, they click on it, they go down to the next level, and we repeat the process. And yes, they're typing out a lot of words with a lot of definitions. Usually my students will go down about 3 or 4 levels until the final level, the words, what I call garbage words. They're not as good as the previous one. And then that word, that is the focus, their organizing principle for their essay or for their paper. Now, after my students get a lot of practice with this, I'll say go thesauricize, this word for one of their universal themes. And instead of taking a couple of hours, they'll come back in about 10 or 15 minutes. They get really good at this. And then finally, when they start to get in the more advanced years of middle school and high school, they're actually finding that they've run through these words several times, that they actually know what they are, how to use them, and while their classmates are cramming their heads with hundreds or thousands of these words, they actually know what they are, which is critically.
Is this part of the process of when you and I spoke, you mentioned that there were certain strategies that you used. You had your 2 questions, but you also had strategies that you used for kids to rely on when they were writing something. One was copy, one was visualize, and one was narrative. Is that what you're explaining? Are those incorporated into the description you just gave?
Yes, that's generally from the narrative side. So one thing that you need to realize with my process, I have been able to connect it with the research in Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz and strategies for struggling writers from Dr. James Collins. Now, with his work, I honestly don't do as much with visualization. I focus on narrative. Now, with copying, here's the key thing with copying. I turn it into a very simple formula, and I have kids type out what they're writing. And here's the key thing. If they make a mistake before they put down a period, they can ask me any question. But if they misspell a name, if they forgot to put a comma where there's an obvious pause or a period or a question mark at the end, I tell them, this is a key thing. You've made a boo-boo. Now you get to retype the whole thing. So this is a key thing. This is what I call controlled frustration. So what these kids will start to do is they'll start getting frustrated with themselves, and they really, really, really start to focus. And as they really start to focus, they're really trying not to make a mistake because they get sick of retyping. And
do they get mad at themselves, or do they get mad at you?
They don't get mad at me. They get frustrated with themselves, and this is why I call this. You have to be very light on this. When I call it controlled frustration, you don't want to let them get too frustrated. You just want to touch on it, because as they really focus, you're going to see them concentrating at a level that, I'm sorry, most non-dyslexics can't get to. They're going to hyper-concentrate, and it's in that moment where the magic is happening, where their brains are now auto-correcting. Okay, I mean, I literally had one student, her name is Courtney, just by going through my basic sentence program, which is only 6 pages long. Her school measured her reading and reading skill each week, and she went from, I think it was like 90 words a minute to about 150, and her mistakes dropped from 7 to 10 a minute to 0 to 1, and her reading jumped by 2.5 grade levels, math by 3, this is primarily word problems, and I was just working on the sentences. So things auto-corrected. So that's the key thing. Now, what do I mean about controlled frustration? What I'm about to tell you is the student's secret, and this is really important, and I would really advise parents not really to try to discuss this with their kids. It's better if they contact me to have the conversation. So I'm going to tell you the typical student. It's a student who you know is very bright, that comes from a family where academics are very important, where a lot of times they have siblings who are fighting to become valedictorians or to be at the absolute top of their class, and this kid is going to feel kind of stupid because they can't. They're doing well enough so they may not even be in special education, but they're nowhere near focusing on their potential. So when I interview the students before I decide to work with them, and I find this pattern, I'll tell the student that I know their secret. And well, this isn't a laughing matter. This is.
I know, but I bet they give you a look like, what secret?
They get a look of absolute terror on their face. Right. Okay? I mean, this is what I mean by parents really shouldn't have this conversation with their child, because the emotions that get released from here can be, quite severe. So when I tell them I know their secret, so what I'll ask them is at some point, especially in your early childhood, in elementary school, you had to pass some academic task. If you couldn't do it, you couldn't move on. You're going to be held back, lose contact with your friends. And at that point, did you get really frustrated? And the key 2 words here are self-loathing and self-hatred. really the students just put so much pressure on themselves. And this is part of what I call advanced controlled frustration, where they would literally just make their mental state so incredibly negative. And during that time, epiphanies would start coming, and they would be able to pass whatever academic task they had to do, usually with a D or C, sometimes better, and move on to the next grade. And when I asked them, I said, this happens so many times in your school career that you've essentially lost count, especially when they're in high school. And they're like, yeah, that's me. And at that point, it's a really important part is a lot of these students really don't want their parents or teachers to know about this. So basically what I have to tell them is this aspect of controlled frustration. I have used it at various intensity levels to get students to perform much quicker than normal. Typically, I'll wait until they're out of high school and 18 and they're adults, they can make their decisions. Like one example of that, the second student that went through my program, his name is Adam. He started off as a senior in high school, failed the New York State English exam with a 47.52 in high school. So we took him through the original program. He increased from the his English exam from 52 to about a 72. Then at the end of the program, he scored in the 70th percentile of entering graduate students. And then he said, I want to learn to read. So I gave him a book called Post-War Japan is History. And the first essay there was written by Professor Dower from MIT, who won the Pulitzer National Book Award.
Russell, was this a book on a topic that he said he was interested in?
Nope. This is no interest. This is pure, unadulterated mass frustration in order to get him to read at the graduate level. This book was designed for first-year students at Harvard. So if you were to go to, again, it's Post-War Japan is History. The first essay is from Professor Dower, and he won the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. And it took 5 sessions, about 4 or 5 hours to get Adam to go through the process, and his brain collapsed within 30 minutes to 45 minutes from starting, and he just pushed through it. The result being not only could he read the material, but he wrote a draft 25-paragraph essay. Now, why is this? But
how long did it take you to get him to be able to do that?
That was 5.
That wasn't just one session.
No, that was 4 or 5 hour sessions, and the break between sessions was a week or 2. Okay. I mean, Adam was 19, a high school graduate, and he was scared about not being able to go to college and be able to read. So I told him how hard this would be, and as an adult, he made the decision. I wouldn't do this with a kid that's not out of high school or not 18.
Did he do any work on his own in between sessions?
No, no homework.
No.
And honestly, during the sessions, I spent most of my time reading Sports Illustrated. I gave him a few directions, and he sat down there. Remember, Adam already scored in the 70th percentile in the GRE.
Right.
And why is this so important? Because I would take this book to Harvard, to Yale, to Cornell, and I would randomly ask students, and just say, I'm doing a brief study, make sure they had no learning concerns, and about half the kids couldn't read it. They could not tell me what Dr. Dower's position was, if they agreed or disagreed with it. They couldn't do it. And a lot of people that have law degrees, MBAs, master's degrees from world-renowned institutions can't read this. They can't tell me what Dr. Dower's position was and if they agreed or disagreed with it.
Now, did you use the audio book technique at all with this student?
No. This is just an example of pure, unadulterated, controlled frustration. So I rarely use this approach. The only time I use it is if I have a student going to college or graduate school who is extraordinarily bright, has already scored in the 70th percentile on the GRE, and has simply said, I have to be able to read. I'm scared. I'm embarrassed. I have to be able to read, and I start in a couple of months. And that's the only reason that I use this. I simply use this as an example. That
Yeah.
when you talk to your student, you're about, about controlled frustration, about how they got so frustrated that they hated themselves.
There's a lot of self-loathing.
Yes, exactly. And then as they move to go to have that epiphany, to move from grade to grade, to get past that academic task, this is not a conversation that you want to have with a student without understanding this, especially if you're a parent, a teacher, an older brother or sister. This really brings up a lot of very negative emotions.
Right.
And I don't. So that's why I've said if you want to have this conversation, that's when the student should talk to me about it, and we can do it in a safe, controlled way.
Right.
If we even need to have the conversation, I said it mirrors a very specific type of student, and I only bring it up to alleviate the stress. Like I had parents come to me say, something happened to my son or daughter. They've given up on life. They're in a mess, and they were such a great student, and this is generally the reason. How do we release that build-up pressure that they've been put under, that they put themselves under, in a safe and secure way? So
you gave me a link, a website, at audible.com, where people can go to find the copies of texts, books that their kids might want to read. Is that correct? And the kids can have the books and also be listening to the audio version of it at audible.com. Am I right?
yes, Audible is owned by Amazon, and I simply like using them because if you don't like a book, they have a very generous return policy. I'm a premier member, so I get 2 books a month for, I don't know, $11.50 a book approximately.
Okay.
So it's just they're the biggest vendor out there. A lot of people use Amazon, so they're owned by Amazon, and it's just easier. I mean, you can go to Barnes and Noble and do this with their technology. I just find this is the one that offers the most books out there.
Russell, you have more enthusiasm than just about anybody I've spoken with. It's contagious. You're doing some amazing things with these young kids, and I'd like you to give our listeners, our mentors, a site or an email where people can get in touch with you both nice and slowly so they can copy it down if they'd like to. And I would encourage our mentors to ask you any questions that they might have regarding your accessibility or about your program, which you said was called what? Writing methods.
Writing methods.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not exactly.
You want them to get in touch with you?
The easiest thing to do, and I'm sorry, my website hasn't showed up on Google yet. Still trying to figure that out. So you have to go up to type in the address, and it's www.dyslexiaremedy.com. So again, www.dyslexia, DYSLEXIA remedy, REMEDY.com, or simply just give me a call on my cell phone. It's area code 518-892-2202. Again, it's 518-892-2202. Just mention you heard about the program on your podcast. And for people that do that, I do spend quite a bit more time to go over the program because, honestly, if you're listening to your podcast, I know that you're much more serious about helping your child or other students that you're working with, and that you take things seriously.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all the time you have given to me, from the pre-talk we had to the discussion today. Russ, thank you so very much. I want to thank our mentors for joining us today. I hope they will go to justeducationfirst.com and learn more about Russell and about the other guests who have so generously given their time to talk about so many of the topics. We have a great lineup coming up of people, again, to continue our discussion on dyslexia. We'll be speaking with a gentleman from Ireland next. We have people from just about every continent around the world speaking on dyslexia, as well as many other topics from autism spectrum to trauma in school to some of the legal issues that we need to address with our kids when we're trying to find the support that they need. Our podcast, I hope, will be a foundation of information for you. Everyone is giving their own perspective here, and I encourage you to go and investigate more about what they're saying and use this as a resource as you delve into some of these topics. We are also on YouTube and on iTunes. I would love to hear some feedback from you. I've gotten some wonderful feedback from people, but I'd also like to have some suggestions of topics or guests that you would like us to reach out to. Again, we're trying to develop a library for you, a free library, a resource for you to use in investigating the needs of struggling students, whether they're at home or at school or that you're supporting in other capacities. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and Mentorship and Education podcast so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week, and thank you.